In this lecture, we will introduce the notion of composition, also sometimes known as aggregation. We'll then discuss how we serialize objects in Java. Inheritance and polymorphism are not the only ways to relate to classes. We also have what's called composition. So this is another way. Now, there's another term for this called aggregation. You can use either term. I'm probably going to use composition over aggregation. The idea with composition is that you have a member of a class actually being an object of some other class. In fact, you can have several members in your class, and each one of them would be an object of one or more classes. The way you can think of this is it's kind of like it has a relationship. So, for example, if you have a person, well, each person has a date of birth, and that date of birth could have information such as the month, the day, the year, and so forth. So what we're pretty much saying here is at least one member of a class in our class, at least one member of this class is an object of a completely different class. Let's go back to our person class as an example. So if you remember from the person class, we had members that stored the first name and the last name of the person. But what if we wanted to keep track of additional information? Maybe, for example, we want to keep track of a personal ID, maybe like a social security number or the date of birth. But what we can do is keep in mind that every person has an ID and every person has a date of birth. So what we can do is we can create a brand new class. And maybe in this case, we're going to call it personal info. And an object of this class would contain information about a person, an ID, and a date of birth. So what this means is one of the members of this class would be a reference variable to the person class. So we have one class that contains an object of the person class, so that object would contain the first and last name. And then if we wanted to store the date of birth, then we can create another class, which in this case maybe we'll call it date, and that would store the month, day, and year of the birth date. And then that means we'd have a reference variable in our personal info class that contains the date. And then we can include some additional operations in here, such as setting and printing the date. And then we can just have a third variable that contains the ID. Here is an example of what our date class could look like. So we have instance variables for the month, the day, and the year. We have two constructors, our default constructor, and one that would have parameters. We can set the date, we can get the month, get the day, get the year. We have toString. We could include additional methods. I do want to mention that these are not abstract methods. Normally they would be defined. I'm just putting the headers of all the methods here. That way you can see everything here and it would all fit into one screen. But these are not abstract methods. We're just showing what kind of operations we would have. Normally we would define these methods, but I think you would have a pretty good idea what each of these methods would do. Here is an example of the personal info class, or at least part of it. I couldn't get everything to fit into one slide, so you'll see the rest of the class on the next slide. The first thing I want you to take a look at are the instance variables up here. So notice that we have name, which is a reference variable of type person, and then we have bday, which is a reference variable of type date. So here is where we take advantage of composition, where we have members of the class that actually store objects of other classes. So in this case, we're going to store an object of the person class, and we're going to store an object of the date class. Then of course, person ID is just some integer. And then take a look at our two constructors here. So our default constructor actually instantiates the name and bday variables. So all we're doing here is we create a new object of the person class for name. We create a new object of the date class for bday. And once again, we're using the default constructors of the person and date class. And then our second constructor, we're passing in a bunch of parameters. So we have the first name, the last name, the month, the day, the year, and the ID. So when we create an object of the person class, we'll pass the first and last names as parameters. For creating an object of the date class, we'll pass the month, the day, and the year. And then, of course, we'll initialize our person ID with the ID parameter. Here is the second part of the personal info class. So in the setPersonalInfo method, we are setting the values of our first and last name, the month, the day, and the year of the birth date, and the ID. So since name and bday are objects of their respective classes, that means I can invoke methods on those objects. So to set the name of the person, I can do name.setName and then pass the first name and last name. For bday, if I want to set the date, I can just invoke the setDate method on the bday object and pass the month, day, and year. And then we have our toString method. So that allows us to print some format for our string. So we have the name, and notice that we're going to invoke the toString methods for the name and the bday objects. So we can have name.toString, and then we have bday.toString, and then of course we would include the person ID. We would concatenate that there. We could have additional methods in here if we wanted to, but this is just a very simple example that shows that we can have objects of other classes within a class.